I just had the distinct honor and pleasure to have a conversation with Jamia in preparation for this conference. And I got off the phone and purchased her book right away. But let me tell you just a little bit about Jamia. And then, of course, you can always go into the National Sexual Assault Conference website and see her full bio along with that of the other plenary speakers. So Jamia Wilson is a feminist activist, writer, and speaker. She is the executive editor at Random House, and before that was the director of the Feminist Press. Jamia has been a leading voice on women's rights issues and advancing equity for over a decade. This week, Jamia's newest book, This Book Is Feminist, an intersectional primer for next generation changemakers, was published and released. And the New York Times book review stated that Jamia treats feminism as a living, breathing, malleable entity that holds the key to dismantling systemic oppression and injustice. And we're just so grateful to have you, Jamia, and thank you so much for making the time to be here with you and inspire us with your words. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. Likewise, meeting you was such an honor and a pleasure. And thank you so much to Valor for the amazing work that you do for us. I am a survivor, and it is healing to me to know that all of us survivors have each of you and everyone who's here supporting us on the front lines every day. So to all of my sibling survivors and those who support us, I see you and I love you. I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, and what I'm going to talk about is narrative power, because the way that I feel that I fight back against the trauma that has inflicted itself upon my life in survivorship is through narrative power and cultural change. It's through amplifying truth and amplifying the truth of the most marginalized voices. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that it's triggering for us, those of us who have survived sexual violence, to live in a media landscape where we have Chris Cuomo at a major media outlet taking part in giving strategy support to advise his brother amidst sexual harassment allegations, or Kevin McCarthy reportedly joking about hitting Nancy Pelosi with a speaker's gavel during a fundraiser. The normalization of violence, against misogyny-affected individuals in this world must stop. And I believe, and I have dedicated a good part of my career in the importance of changing the narrative, transforming the conversation, and amplifying our voices, because in my point of view, silence is poison. And since the beginning of colonization, violence against women, girls, trans people, that has been used to assert cultural, economic, political, and sexual power in this country and beyond. And depictions of us, our bodies, in hypersexualized and caricatured ways justify causing the kind of pain and casting the kind of objectionization and labor exploitation that persists in every other facet of our identities and lives. And when racialized sexual violence and abuse become normalized, tolerated, and perpetuated in our culture, it becomes a part of the air. It becomes a part of the things that we absorb, like pollution, and we do not move forward and we do not erase its ill effects unless we interrupt it, and unless we do what one of my friends and mentors, Gloria Steinem, has said, which is to name it in order to change it. So what I want to talk about today is to name it. What does it mean for us to take on misogyny by amplifying our voices, by changing the conversation, by changing culture? Because I really believe that stories about our testimony, organized resistance that also involves our collective voices that are way too often sidelined from our headlines, way too often undermined and positioned in ways that hurt us instead of helping us. Those things really influence the court of public opinion. And we all know that, unfortunately, a lot of times in the conversation we're having, the court of public opinion is everything, and we're on the wrong side of it. So I want to talk about what it means to take off the shroud of silence and shame, to stand in the face of doubts that are cast upon us, and to disrupt narratives that perpetuate injustice in the media by fighting for institutional change, fighting for equity and parity at all levels of decision-making in these industries, from audiovisual media to publishing, online, offline books, etc. What does it mean for us to ramp up our efforts to ensure that survivor stories are positioned in ways that serve us and position in ways that move forward our survivor-informed agenda? I was thinking about this conversation and how I wanted to engage in it because we have a short amount of time to talk together today, and really thought about what led me to want to tell my own story of survivorship and life, and also to help champion the voices of other survivors in many different capacities and media roles I've had, but more recently at the Feminist Press specifically, where I did get the honor of helping to amplify survivor stories in books like the We Too book, which is a collection of stories from sex workers who are saying we too are survivors of sexual violence, and why are we being left out of the conversation? And when I thought about why this is what I wanted to talk with you about today, I thought about how I grew up hearing stories about the devastating depths of human cruelty, about women I loved generations before me who were sexually assaulted, and how hearing their stories not only informed my work today and my own healing, but also inspire me to heed the call to action that Ida B. Wells made, which is that the way to right wrongs is to shine the light of truth on them. I learned from my foremothers that the struggle is not new, that our shared values can build momentum, and we can shift cultural narratives and even influence policy. Through their examples, I've learned to speak truth to power, to use my strength, my voice, and my vision to play the long game, and to trust that the world we're in, although very much not where we need it to be, can and must be better, even if we can encounter resistance from folks who don't get it yet, even when we do have a media that all too often positions our stories in ways that make excuses for perpetrators. Even if the media wants to exist in binaries or to move in frameworks that aren't restorative, as someone who did seek restorative justice for my own experience with assault. So the reason I want to talk about this is that I am a member of the media. I have worked now in a variety of different capacities in the media, and I include myself as a part of the media landscape, people who are driving the most potent educational tool in our lives, the eyes of the world, as I like to see it and say it. And what I want to call on us to think about today is to think about what it would mean for us to share our stories, to own them. And for those of us who have organizations and platforms and access to amplifying stories, what does it mean for us to think about ways in which we can release the shackles of internalized oppression, white supremacy, misogyny, and capitalism, to think about how we tell stories in ways that serve the whole of us and not just some of us? Whose stories do we need to push to the front and whose get left behind? Whose stories do we need to bring from the margins and to the center? That is really important to me. And what I ask of myself every day is to think about the times in which I had wished other people would have been more brave about how they supported my story, and then charge that upon myself to help ignite the decisions I make as a gatekeeper in an industry that needs more liberation. Because all too often we receive cultural, social, and political messages that teach us that our value is based on our ability or our inability to fit into a narrow ideal, rather than our ability to lead, to teach, to transform, to enact change, our ability or inability to have the kind of credibility that only a select few can possess because they happen to be born cis, white, able-bodied men who are documented. All of our voices matter. All of our stories matter. And it's not enough for one story or one kind of so-called perfect victim narrative to be the litmus test for whose stories need to be heard. One of the reasons that I like to look so much back on past generations is to find inspiration on the people who were bold enough and brave enough to express themselves despite grave obstacles. And when I think of those stories, I think of the stories of Toni Morrison, who sat in Random House many years before me, paving the way for someone like me to have the role I have now, to amplify voices who I could have never dreamed of supporting when I was a young aspiring writer and aspiring publisher. And in Beloved, Toni Morrison had baby Suggs write that yonder they do not love this flesh. They, the online bullies, the non-survivor informed editors and decision makers in the media, the fashion industrial complex, as I like to call it, and some advertisers, sometimes they, as Toni Morrison wrote it, despise our voice and despise our flesh. And with the knowledge of that, what does that mean for us? Well, to me, what I've realized is that in our rejection of this idea that we are disposable because our stories are somehow inconvenient or replaceable or seen as less than, it is why I speak regardless, because I truly believe that if we don't define ourselves, somebody else will. Because we're in a media landscape where only 3% of the clout positions are held by women, and even less of those are held by non-binary people and people of color. So the reason I share this today, and the reason I share this with even more passion, is that I come to you triggered this week because I dared to write a book celebrating Black lives a few years ago for children. And I received a very triggering, a very disgusting and wicked message from a man who sent me a video of another man mocking my book and speaking about my book without facts, driving droves of people to harass, intimidate, and send me death threats and rape threats. I was already planning on talking with you about narrative power today, but when I really thought about the trigger that it gave me, how it brought me back to the moment of my own subjugation, how it brought me to a place of feeling like I needed to shrink myself. Oh, that maybe if I had not written my book, if I had just not been out there in the world, as the police had told me the last time I called in a rape threat and a death threat, that maybe you shouldn't be so provocative or say controversial things. I am here to speak. I am here to call him and the other cowards out who try to intimidate and harass us for speaking, and say, the backlash is a sign of progress. You are threatened by my voice, and I will keep on speaking as long as I'm alive, and my books will speak beyond my death. To each of you, speak, speak, speak. We need your voices, and I say this with love. Thank you so much.